Miami's toast. It's very low, but the rocks underneath it are just porous. It's a sponge. And so you can't even build a wall around Miami because the water just comes up from below. Miami is one of the most vulnerable places in the world.
Wow. Chicago's okay though, right? We're 182 meters above sea level.
You're doing okay in Chicago. Everybody from Miami is going to move back to Chicago.
Some of them can come. Okay, so let's see. So going back to the mangroves. Mangrove forests, coastal ecosystems, and coastal cities are what we're mostly talking about today. Mangroves are coastal woods, like those in Florida's Everglades, Kenya's Gazi Bay, and all along the coasts of Indonesia. Coastal cities are those like Miami or Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. Jakarta is almost 4 times the size of Miami. It's got 11 million people in it, while Miami has less than 3 million. But both will soon be underwater. So the Indonesian government is planning to move Jakarta from Java to Borneo. Miami, on the other hand, well, it was big news there when the new governor of Florida, where Miami is located, even uttered the words climate change, and that didn't happen until 2019. Coastal ecosystems like mangroves, marshes, and seagrasses are key to meeting the climate challenge, in part because they can help us slow climate change by pulling carbon from the air and infusing it into the ocean floor, but also because they can act as buffers against rising seas. Mangroves, for example, protect us from both sudden storms and gradual erosion. They provide shelter for young fish, breeding grounds for shrimp, and wood for local villagers, all while sequestering at least 4 times as much carbon per hectare as regular forests do because they migrate out to sea as the ground beneath them rises. Saving mangroves is key to reversing climate change, and I wrote a lot about mangroves in the years leading up to the 2010 climate negotiations in Cancun, Mexico. That's the year I met today's guest, Steve Crooks, who is one of the world's foremost experts on the interconnected systems of mangroves, marshes, kelp, and seaweed that are constantly pulling carbon dioxide from the air, breaking it into carbon and oxygen, and infusing the carbon into the bottom of the sea. It's called the blue carbon system, a term first coined more than 11 years ago, but one that's increasingly critical to meeting the climate challenge.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth. We broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields. And not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we revisit coastal ecosystems for an update on how mangroves, salt marshes, seaweed, and seagrasses can be saved and managed to slow and maybe even reverse climate change. Today I'm speaking with Steve Crooks. He's an oceanographer and a sedimentologist, meaning he's a scientist who studies the seas, the sand, the soil, and all the living systems that link them together. He is, in other words, one of the world's leading experts on coastal ecosystems and wetlands, and he's advised everyone from the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to the Smithsonian Institution, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, and the Verified Carbon Standard on how to manage mangroves, salt marshes, and other aquatic systems so they can act as giant carbon sinks. He also co-edited a book called A Blue Carbon Primer, which came out last year and offers a deep dive into the biology of mangroves, marshes, and other aquatic systems, as well as how carbon moves through these systems on its way from the air into the earth. If you find today's show intriguing, I recommend picking up a copy, although as an academic work, it's kind of pricey at $60 for the paperback. The title again is A Blue Carbon Primer. 4 years ago, Steve co-founded Sylvestrum Climate Associates, which is the U.S. branch of European climate consultancy Sylvestrum. Among the projects he's working on there, together with the government of Sindh, Pakistan, is the Indus Delta Red Plus Mangrove Project, which aims to restore 350,000 hectares of degraded mangrove forest, or a mangrove forest containing 1 billion mangrove trees. Yeah, I know. Lots of people are raising money these days to plant trees. It's kind of the new thing. But most of the people who started in the last year or two won't let you know if the trees they plant live, die, or even take root. But the Indus Delta Project is a Red Plus project created under the Verified Carbon Standard using methodologies that Steve helped create and that are certified by third-party verifiers. If you're a regular listener, you know that we covered Red Plus in episodes 49, 50, and 51. In a nutshell, these types of projects don't just plant a bunch of trees and say, mission accomplished. Instead, they save and restore forests using methodologies developed under carbon standards based on guidance provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which represents a global consensus of the best science on the matter. And they only get paid for the trees that survive into adulthood and deliver verified ecological benefit over decades. In the second half of today's show, Steve and I will take you on a virtual flyover above the Indus Red Plus project. But we start with a quick overview of blue carbon in general, what the term means, how it evolved, and how it might be leveraged to save these critical ecosystems. Before we dive in, I wanted to remind you that Bionic Planet is listener-supported. I produce these shows on my own time and my own dime, and those dimes are pretty dear these days, which is why my production has dropped off after the pandemic hit. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more, then help me out by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet is all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. If money's tight, you can also help by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Remember, the more stars I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet the climate challenge. We can do it if we all work together. I first met Steve Crooks in 2010 at a Forest Trends workshop in Vietnam. And as we started our chat today, he reminded me that it was actually 10 years ago today that we met. Here's my interview with Stephen Crooks. I'm recording now, and can we just reiterate what you said a moment ago? You said you'd gotten a Facebook alert or an anniversary alert just this morning saying that you and I met exactly 10 years ago today, right?
Yeah, it was exactly 10 years ago to the day.
Yeah, a harmonic convergence, I guess. It was a Katoomba meeting, and Blue Carbon was just getting going. And Forest Trends, they used to have these Katoomba meetings where they'd bring international and local experts from around the world together in hot spots like, the Pantanal in Brazil or the Red River Delta, which is where you and I met. Although we actually met in Hanoi, but to workshop different practices. I remember when you and I met, the World Cup was going on, and we were both wandering around Hanoi looking for a place to watch the game or the match. I think Germany might have been playing. I don't remember all the details, but we each ended up at the same food vendor stand because the guy had a little TV out there. And I was there to cover the event for Ecosystem Marketplace, and you were presenting, right? I mean,
Yeah, that was it. I'd been invited to the Katoomba meeting by Winnie Lau,
Yes.
who was at Forest Trends at the time. I'd been in DC to meet with the World Bank, and we'd got an introduction actually from the Undersecretary for Climate Change from California, who was he was listening to this blue carbon story that we were telling about the Sacramento Delta in California, and he said, "Oh, you should go meet with the folks in the World Bank and also the IUCN." Mm-hmm. And so there was a meeting at the IUCN, and Forest Trends was there, Conservation International were there, TNC and others. And that's when a lot of the plotting started. And so fairly soon after that, we'd initiated the Blue Carbon Initiative with Conservation International, the IUCN, and Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. And Winnie had whisked me off to Vietnam to meet with all the folks there. So,
yeah, that was an incredible event. And, we recorded the public presentations, not the workshops, because they went on for hours and hours, but the public presentations. And they're still archived on the Ecosystem Marketplace website. I was going over some of them ahead of this call. A lot of them are related to policy issues that are very specific to Vietnam, but the scientific ideas that were being presented, they still hold up. I mean, a lot has changed in the past 10 years. There are the carbon methodologies which didn't exist back then and which do now, and which you are one of many people who worked on them. But the trajectory was there 10 years ago. And I may include a link to that Katoomba meeting in the show notes for today's episode.
Yeah, and the trip down into the Red River Delta was, really informative too. Mm-hmm. We drove through something like 100 miles of what used to be mangrove systems, through rice fields, and we got down into shrimp farms. And then we got right to the very edge, and there was this tiny, horribly degraded little remains of a mangrove. It must have only been like a few hectares in size. And the fishermen were complaining that mangrove was in the way of them doing their fishing. And it was the last little patch, and the amount of degradation that was going on was just unbelievable. But the entire delta is, completely unsustainable because the whole system is sinking. Mm-hmm. And, there's going to be real challenges with sea level rise there. You could see how low everything was. And, but everybody there was eking out a living either in shrimp ponds or in rice fields.
Yeah, it's such a tragedy. Even if they could adapt their activities, they're going to get hit with sea level rise, right? I mean, that's really not much we can do about that.
Yeah. They truly are living right on the very edge, and so it's a big question about, because clearly, they're making a living. They may be doing quite well, but a time will come when it's going to become more and more difficult. And so how do you balance adaptation to climate change with sustaining a rural economy when you're in such a vulnerable location? Yeah. There's actually an interesting side story is that one of the things we observed, we were talking to the local government people, was that they were spending $5 million a year to dredge the channels, the Red River Channel, because of siltation. And we talked about, if you restore some mangroves at the back end of the delta, at the top end, what happens is that the increased tidal flows that are going all the way up and down the channel to get to those mangroves, they self-scour the channel. And so you could save maybe $5 million a year in dredging costs, which, seemed like a good idea. But then we realized that they didn't want this good idea, because the money was coming from central government to local government. And the last thing they needed was to have that money stop. So they would much rather pay to be dredging rather than use the money to restore the wetlands in that case.
Yeah, perverse incentives are killing us everywhere. Although, one thing in Madrid at last year's Climate Talks, and that's when we did the interview that's going to be the second half of today's show, you had talked about the Red River Delta. I don't remember if you mentioned it in the interview that's going to be the second half of today's show, because I did that a while back. But you said that it would be hard to implement a project in the Red River Delta like the one you're doing in the Indus Delta. The Red River people had challenges that would make it harder. And I don't remember how you phrased it. Can you maybe do a quick compare and contrast between the two?
That's a good question. And it really, the Red River Delta and very populated systems like that is going to take a lot of planning, integrated adaptation. What are you going to do with sediment management? Where are you going to put your wetlands? The situation in Pakistan is somewhat easier because there's so much space. It's a very sparsely populated setting, lots of open space area where mangroves are going to migrate. And you still need to work and develop the adaptation strategies for the local communities who are going to have to deal with sea level rise. But we have the space to do that in the Indus, which makes that really interesting.
Maybe I can fast forward to Madrid now, too. That was the 25th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, COP25. Chile was the president of the COP this year, but the actual meeting took place in Madrid, and because of the unrest in Chile, and they were calling it a blue COP, meaning they were going to focus on oceans. I came in expecting this idea of a blue COP or a focus on oceans to mean focusing on how we need to protect the oceans because they're absorbing most of the excess heat, like 90%, and they're suffering as a result. They're also absorbing all this carbon, and they're getting acidic as a result of that. So I came in expecting the whole focus to be on how do we protect oceans. But there was also all this talk about how oceans can protect us, how we can use them as carbon sinks, continued carbon sinks. And a lot of it was stuff that you and I have been talking about for 10 years. Not just mangroves and seagrasses, but seaweed and kelp and microalgae. And I have to admit, I felt like my layman's naivety was vindicated a bit in Madrid because I've always thought that we should be harvesting the algal blooms from the Gulf of Mexico, for example, for biofuel or something, taking something bad that's happening and doing something good with it. And every time I open my mouth about this at a marine conference or something, I remember one in particular in Washington, D.C., it was also a Katuma meeting focused around the Chesapeake Bay, and I brought this idea up, and I got lectured by a lot of the policy guys on the dangers of unintended consequences. That if we tried to make these algal blooms into something good, it might encourage or it might discourage the discouragement of farmers. It might encourage farmers. It might take the pressure off of farmers to reduce the amount of runoff going into the rivers and streams that feed into the Gulf. So it might have a perverse effect, is what a lot of people kind of threw back at me, and I get that. These are complex systems, and our own society is a complex system embedded within a complex biological system, and we don't want to go off half-cocked and make a bigger mess of things. We've done that way too many times. It's kind of like the federal funding for dredging that you alluded to earlier. But when I got to Madrid, all of these issues were suddenly huge. Everybody was talking about them. Everybody was talking about kelp farming and microalgae and seaweed and one that I never heard of, which is whale carbon. I know you said in our emails that whales were beyond your area of expertise. You didn't want to comment on it, but for listeners, I'll just say that whales eat tons and tons of plankton, and then they die with about 30 or 35, I forget how many tons of carbon in their skeletons each. And then they sink to the bottom. The carbon stays there for centuries, and it could ends up to being a huge amount. So saving whales is a very popular climate issue now. and I'd never heard of it before I got to Madrid. And where I'm going with this in a roundabout way is that I came into Madrid thinking I knew what blue carbon was. Mangroves, seagrasses, salt marshes. Then I thought this other stuff, the kelp farming and everything, was next generation. And now it all seemed to be bundled together, and I'm not sure where we draw the line between ocean carbon, if there is such a thing, and blue carbon, and how it all fits together. And also how the thinking has evolved over the past 10 years. Are we talking about kelp farming now because the science has finally evolved? Or has the science always been there and policy is just now catching up?
The concept of blue carbon itself really reflects the extraction of CO2 from the atmosphere or coastal waters, near surface waters, but then the deposition within sediment, where it goes into long-term storage. So we have to be very careful about how we think about oceans, because you're right, the oceans absorb so much CO2 out of the atmosphere, but it's leading to a buildup of acidity. That's not the blue carbon aspect of this. The important part is getting it out of the ocean and into sediment, or getting it out of the atmosphere and into sediment. And so the discussions have been evolving over the last 10 years. Back in the days of Kyoto, there was reference to coastal marine ecosystems, but nothing was really done about that. There was a strong focus on, mostly on forests, to some degree on soils. And the oceans were left to one side, the coastal marine ecosystems were left on one side. But then, around about 10 years ago, the report by the IUCN and UNEP focused, really trying to bring back the attention again on, we should be thinking about these marine ecosystems. And that's kind of where it began. We started getting our feet wet, thinking about, there are terrestrial frameworks being developed for climate change mitigation, which at the UNFCCC level, people were becoming more comfortable with. If we got to oceans, everybody would have, that would have been a non-starter. People would have freaked out because it's a whole new concept. And so we began just getting our toes wet a little bit, moving down slope, and started dipping into the coastal marshes, the mangroves, the tidal forests, the seagrasses, the salt marshes, because the science was the clearest. But really, from a policy perspective, people could get their feet wet and still use terrestrial frameworks such as RED to capture this and bring it into a policy context. And now that we're comfortable about that and the science is solidifying further, now we're starting to think more about the flows and the broader ocean systems and where they fit in. So it's a gradual trend towards expanding our knowledge and including more ecosystems.
That's kind of what this blue carbon primer that you co-edited says too. One other thing that I'm not yet clear on, and I apologize if it's in the book. I'm bouncing around. It's a pretty challenging work, and some of the chapters are more technical than others. And so this may be answered in there and may have gone right over my head. But what happens when a mangrove dies? I mean, these things have been laying down carbon for centuries. The carbon's in the soil, which the trees are holding in place. Does all this carbon that these mangroves have injected into the ground, does it come out when they die, or does it stay down there? Can we talk about that a bit?
Let's even think about the bigger scale, and then we'll dive down into the mangroves. So, if we think over 20 million years, 20 million years ago was a much warmer planet. And, scientists have been thinking about, what took us into these warming and cooling cycles sensitive to Milankovitch cycles. And one of the interesting things is that the deltaic
Just to clarify,
systems,
the Milankovitch cycles are the Ice Age cycles.
Yes, driven by, the
wobble?
The wobble of the Earth, the wobble and the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, and it leads to warming and cooling cycles. So there's big expansive glaciers, you mentioned glaciers at the poles. And but what about CO2? And so CO2 over the last 20 million years has been gradually extracted from the atmosphere, within, as part of a large trend. And one of the forces for that has been these big deltas, mangrove systems and coastal wetlands, where CO2 has been extracted from the atmosphere, goes into the plants, goes into the soil, but deltas are a way of getting carbon buried really deep, and it eventually ends up down in what we call the lithosphere, in the rocks, which becomes, your source of fossil fuels ultimately in the long time frame. So if you actually do a calculation of how much CO2 is being extracted by the world's largest deltas around the world, you come back to, removing something like 100 ppm out of the atmosphere over 20 million years.
Whoa, 100. Sorry, but yeah, ppm, first of all, that's parts per million, and we're at 280 ppm, or we're at 280 ppm before the Industrial Revolution, but we're over 400 now, so 100 ppm is huge.
Yeah. So that's enough to drop it down. Of course, there are other things going on as well, but it's fascinating. So these coastal ecosystems have been this extractor of CO2 from the atmosphere for millions of years. Of course, now we've massively modified most of the big deltas of the world, so they're no longer providing that function that they once did. So the mangroves themselves, they're really cool ecosystems, trees which go at the edge of the sea. And as sea level rises, if the sea level rise is not too high, they will build up in location, and so deposit carbon within soils that accumulate beneath them. And as a little bit of sea level rise is actually a good thing, a few millimeters, it leads to the accumulation of organic soils, which may be in parts of the world maybe 10 meters deep, and commonly they may be about 3 meters deep. If sea level rise is higher, then they have to have space to migrate landwards. And then you get into the question, well, what happens when mangroves die? You brought up that really good question. It depends on what the driver of the death is. If mangroves die because somebody chops down the forest, well, of course, the biomass goes back to the atmosphere at some point. The soils get destabilized. You start to lose maybe the top 20 centimeters if it's just clear cutting. But if you're converting them to shrimp ponds, then you're digging down into those organic soils, and you can lose 1 meter to 2 meters worth of carbon back to the atmosphere within a few decades. And in fact, that carbon may have taken thousands of years to accumulate. And so the emissions part of the curve is much steeper than what it is the gradual sequestration under a natural system. So that's why there's a big emphasis on trying to conserve existing intact ecosystems, because the emissions part of it is so rapid.
And that's why mangroves account for something like 0.7% of all forests, but at 1.10% of all emissions associated with deforestation came from mangroves.
Yes, something of that order, and that's because they sit on these organic soils. A lot of terrestrial forests sit on very shallow soils, no organic content in them. And so that's why many of the things like the RED program and the way people thought about terrestrial forests is they focused on where the big stocks were, and that was in the trees. But when you think about swamps, which forest on organic soils, on wetlands, then when you think about peatlands, forested peatlands, most of the carbon is in the soil, and the trees are actually a relatively small part of that. And that holds true for mangroves. Many mangrove systems, even the dwarf mangroves, which might only be maybe 3 foot tall. Actually, the biomass could be the same as a tall mangrove system because of the density of the plants. But even with a tall mangrove, the most of the carbon is actually in the soil than the biomass. And so we tend to miss a lot of that.
Can we now differentiate between the main coastal ecosystems? We've talked a lot about mangroves, but you've got tidal marshes, seagrasses, and peatlands. Can you differentiate among these 4 different types? Yeah,
so the coastal ecosystems are a continuum, and it's a mosaic of habitat that it goes down from the terrestrial, let's say forests and upland areas, and then as you get down into the wetlands, you may get into coastal swamps. Many parts of the world you get into peat swamps, and then you get to the edge where it gets more saline, and you get down into either tidal marshes or you get into mangroves. Mangroves are found in the tropics. Those species are frost intolerant, and so when you move towards the temperate areas, they get knocked back by frost. And so where you would find mangroves in the tropics, you find marshes, which are grasslands. in temperate areas. And then offshore, you get the seagrasses. So it's a continuum of ecosystems. Not all coastal peatlands formed from mangroves, per se. They may have formed at the same time. Somehow, when you think about the massive coastal peat domes of Southeast Asia, often they were underlain by mangrove systems which built up starting around about maybe 6 to 8,000 years ago. They built up. And then because it rained so much, the organic soils just kept accumulating. And they built these huge domes of organic soils which might be 6 or 8 meters tall. And of course, that's where all the palm plantations are going in. And then, of course, you get into the northern latitudes, Alaska or Scandinavia or Scotland, where because the land is actually moving up there, because the release of the ice sheets retreated back, and so the land rebounds and moves up, and there you get actually things like seagrasses and salt marshes, which find themselves high and dry. But again, because it's a wet climate, they get taken over and become peatlands. So you find sequences of peat soils with maybe marshes and the like underneath them.
One thing we hear a lot about is when the tundra thaws and all of these peatlands that are frozen below start to melt as well. We'll get this huge methane bomb, and methane traps its 80 times as much heat as carbon dioxide does in the short term. Can that be countered by aggressively planting tidal marshes on top of these melted peatlands as soon as the thaw begins? Or is that just like a pipe dream? Is that just wishful thinking, me not knowing what I'm talking about?
No, because most of those ecosystems are the boreal soils are mostly terrestrial, and so there's nothing we can do there. It's certainly not for mangroves because it's way too cold. When you get into those ecosystems, they're more at the response side of the equation. If we don't deal with keeping things temperatures under control, we're just going to have this massive outflow of both methane as the soils warm and you start to get microbial processes, but also CO2 emissions where the soil's dry. And so it's going to be one of those big feedback mechanisms which are going to lead to more warming. And so that's how things get out of control. When you look at warming and cooling cycles, through the geological record, you notice that things move relatively quickly from one state to another. It's not this slow, gradual transition. It's actually a rapid turnover from one state to the next. And these cycles, such as we see with the thawing or the production of boreal peatlands, are part of this feedback that either leads to warming or cooling.
Yeah, so we've got to stop it or it's game over.
Yeah. It's certainly going to be, yes, yeah.
That'll be rough. How about the other ecosystems and seagrasses and tidal marshes? Is it the same issue as with mangroves in that the carbon that's being captured is not what we see on the surface, but way down in the soil?
Where we've done the accounting, for instance, the IPCC wetland supplement, we thought about it very simplistically. Only a certain number of ecosystems, atmosphere or nearshore waters, plants, soil. And we can quantify those stocks and stock changes. But ecosystems like seagrasses, they don't hold a great deal within the soil. Some do, the Posidonias out there hold a lot. But seagrasses are expansive. But all of these ecosystems are taking, as well as taking out this atmosphere and burying some of the residual within the soil, they're transporting it laterally. And so a lot of carbon is being exported and either going into dissolved form within the ocean, or it goes and gets buried somewhere else. And we're totally missing all of that within these equations.
Can we talk about that a bit? How when you talk about this lateral movement, where it's captured, where does it go? Where does it end up?
Yeah, so let's if we expand our definition of blue carbon ecosystems now to include something that's more obvious, like a kelp bed, a kelp forest. Now, kelp, it grows on rocks, and so kelp is incredibly productive. It produces so much biomass each year, and a lot of that recycled through the water column and back to the atmosphere. But some of the research that's been going on in the last few years is highlighting, maybe a large amount of that carbon, as these fonds, as they call, break off and float away, they get dispersed across the near shore and even go down into the deep ocean, where maybe half of that carbon, certainly maybe 10, 20, 30% of it gets buried. And so they're constantly shedding particulate carbon into the water column around them, where it settles down and sinks and gets buried. So now we have to think about two things. One, can we conserve the kelp in this case and maintain that extraction from the water column, which is then filtering through the ecosystem? But then what do we do about where it lands up? If it's landing up on a seabed where we are trawling seabed all the time, then that carbon's going to get redispersed and constantly broken down by microbial action and oxygen. So can we manage areas better so that the sinks are protected, which allow for carbon accumulation there? So we're starting to get into these more complicated aspects of carbon management. And that's why when we think about things like marine protected areas, it gets really interesting. People are starting to think about where do marine protected areas fit into NDCs, for example. Well, they fit on both the adaptation side, because marine protected areas leads to improved fisheries, etc. But it also provides a management framework for the carbon storage function, which is on the mitigation side of carbon management. And so we're starting to connect the dots there.
Yeah, but you're not defining terms. Sorry. A marine protected area, just for the listeners here, it's an area where you restrict human activity, like you say no fishing, and you do and other activities like that, and you do it for the common good. Maybe you're doing it to ensure there's more fish for the future, or just to conserve, but you're basically saying no go here, or these certain activities don't happen here. You also mentioned NDCs. These are nationally determined contributions. That's essentially the climate action plans the countries have submitted under the Paris Agreement. And we should also differentiate between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is slowing climate change, or hopefully reversing it. Adaptation is adapting to it. And it's important to emphasize, as you do, that these coastal systems deliver both mitigation and adaptation. I guess the question I have is, when it comes to mitigation, we've talked about saving or reviving mangroves and marshes, but what kinds of interventions can we do in these other systems like kelp farms and microalgae? I mean, the ideas have been there forever, but in the last few years, it's gone from stuff that people always talk about in bars, but never in policy discussions, to stuff that's everywhere. I'm sure you scientists are always talking about it in classrooms, but it's always been next level, always too uncertain, always like, yeah, that's really interesting stuff, but you know what? No one really takes it seriously, and now it's everywhere. So I guess I have two questions here. One is, what kinds of interventions can we do? Do we just get out of the way, let nature take its course, or are we actively managing these systems? And also I mentioned my pet idea of going down into the Gulf of Mexico, where you've got these big dead zones because of all the nutrients coming down from the farms in the Midwest to the U.S., and just taking all the seaweed and harvesting it, using it as biofuels or food, making it a form of mariculture. I know that not all seaweed is edible, but a lot of it is. I mean, there's all this stuff out there, all these ideas flying around. And I went from hearing people tell me that my own ideas were out there and a symptom of my naivety, to feeling like all of a sudden people are taking things that I was told are just pipe dreams and run with them. And I just don't know how much of it's realistic, how much of it is next generation, and how much of it is just fantasy. Or how much of it is precise enough to support through carbon markets if that's what's needed to make them happen. I threw a lot out there, but I hope you can run with it. You've been pretty good at that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and you're right. It always has been felt as maybe next generation or unfeasible. But I think really, the Paris Agreement really opened the door to thinking about coastal marine ecosystems more holistically. And then the Ocean Pathway, which came out of COP23, and led by Fiji. It sort of stimulated a lot of interest to try and move things forward. The blue carbon work and the blue carbon initiative activities really provided, I think, a bridgehead to think about this, because this was established. It was within the IPCCs, within the greenhouse gas accounting, and it provides a way that I think we can start to think about these other ecosystems. How can we broaden it to include these other types of ecosystems? What quantification do we need to do so that we can develop our default values, our way of quantifying emissions and removals associated with the management of them? The NDCs, again, were important because they provide the signal that a country is serious about managing its greenhouse gases in certain ways. And so if they're, one of the, I think 153 countries have some form of blue carbon ecosystem, something like 70 countries have all three of the primary ecosystems, and other countries have the kelps as well. So that's a lot of countries who can be doing something with their coastal ecosystems. The first thing we can do is manage them more holistically. We might not know the quantification yet, but that if you're managing ecosystems better, be it forests, soils, marine ecosystems, you're not going to be having a negative impact on greenhouse gas emissions. You're most likely going to be having a positive impact, and so that's a good thing. So we can build on the initiatives that countries have been going through, such as developing marine protected areas, conserving ecosystems, think about green infrastructure, and work on those adaptation measures, those livelihood measures. At the same time, we can be improving our quantification. So we'll get a better sense of how, what is the quantification around kelp? Where does mariculture fit into this? How does managing the seabed fit into this? We'll improve that. But it doesn't mean we have to wait till the quantification is perfect. We can work on the management side and get those protocol, those procedures and those institutional arrangements all set up.
Right. So yeah, start taking care of it now while we can, because it's the right thing to do. And the quantification comes later for national carbon accounting under the Paris Agreement or whatever comes after it. And then maybe for supporting activities through market mechanisms if necessary. I mean, if it turns out that local people would have to incur a cost if they're providing the carbon sequestration for the rest of us, we should compensate them somehow. Or are these like win-wins, like with nutrient management in farming, where the co-benefits pay for themselves, so there might not be a need for market mechanisms, or maybe there's not enough certainty to do offsetting, but there might be some other kind of support that we have to do or should do to make them happen.
Well, we really want to try and find those win-win situations and support those. That's why marine protected areas are really coming to the fore, because, they're coming about because people, countries, communities want to manage their fisheries in a more sustainable manner. And they realize that, that's not been happening, but that if you have marine protected areas, you can sustain a viable fish population that everybody benefits from. Well, if you're doing that, you can include carbon management at the same time. It's clearly a win-win situation for all involved. And, a lot of the coastal ecosystems which have been lost have been because of a single actor who was gaining something from a short period of time. The shrimp ponds which have went in might have in peatlands particularly, they might have a life cycle about 10 years. Other places, it's a longer life cycle. But, that's kind of slash and burn agriculture, which is having massive impacts on coastal communities who are dependent upon local fisheries, and now they don't have the fisheries anymore. So how can we better manage our coastal ecosystems and try and connect a lot of the dots here? You mentioned mariculture earlier on. That really is nascent technology, but it's really interesting because, can we grow various types of algae that have a carbon benefit where they're shedding carbon through the ecosystem? You might be growing it on floating platforms and it's releasing carbon into the atmosphere, yet you might be producing other products, food products, or biofuels, or replacements for oils that are devastating other types of coastal wetlands where people grow, like palm. Is there something you can grow from mariculture? And so I think the opportunities there for business models are really interesting. So, we are working right now with a company called Offsetters and working with the First Nations communities of British Columbia. And we're starting to look there at how to think about marine protected areas. Where does mariculture, which they're already doing, where does that fit into these kind of questions? And then another organization was talking to us yesterday about the same sort of thing in the tropics. The Scandinavians are interested in it. The Chinese and the Koreans have been doing mariculture for a long time. And I must admit, the various seaweeds that we eat for breakfast when in China and in Korea are really tasty. So I think that there's definitely a model there. There's a business model that we can really be expanding on. Can we get more of a circular economy around these more sustainable processes?
Of course, and there are also all these complicating issues about which types of seaweeds we cultivate. Are we then creating another imbalance? Yeah, it's a rabbit hole. One thing we touched on that I'd like to explore before moving to the Madrid interview is the role of NDCs, nationally determined contributions or climate action plans under the Paris Agreement, and how these NDCs accelerated the emergence of blue carbon. We saw this on the forestry side, and I've covered it pretty extensively, but I haven't covered it in blue carbon. What I'm talking about is that international negotiators at the climate talks in the UNFCCC, they weren't paying huge amounts of attention to blue carbon or to forestry or to agriculture. Focus was all on fossil fuels. Not all, but it was predominantly on fossil fuels until countries started submitting their NDCs, their climate action plans. And then all of a sudden we saw all these countries saying, we're going to reduce emissions by saving the forest or by shifting to climate-smart agriculture or improving the way we manage mangroves, or we're going to adapt to climate change through management of these same ecosystems or these same practices. I know this was a big surprise in the forestry and farming sectors, and I assume it was the same in the blue carbon world, right?
It was, it was a very pleasant surprise. There was a lot of energy building up around Paris. The wetland supplement had already come out the year before, and so countries were becoming aware. The Coalition for Rainforest Nations had been broadcasting the message about mangroves, Conservation International, IUCN, IOC of UNESCO, and so when there was recognition of blue carbon ecosystems or coastal and marine ecosystems or mangroves, some countries mentioned individual habitat types. It was the terms used were all over the board, but that didn't really matter because they were talking about improved management of coastal ecosystems, which is the key part of it. And it really did provide some energy towards further work going forward after that. Most of the thinking was on the adaptation side, on the livelihood side, and that's fine. Because as we've been talking, if you improve the management, you lead to better outcomes in terms of greenhouse gases. And as we're looking to going into this next round of NDCs, countries are starting to ask how can they be more ambitious about including these coastal ecosystems. And there's a lot of interest now in countries including mangroves, but other ecosystems, marshes, seagrasses within their greenhouse gas inventories, which is a critical step really on the mitigation side of an NDC. Once you have it in an inventory, you're starting to recognize how management actions can have a positive or negative effect on your carbon stocks of coastal systems. So it's been hugely positive. But at the same time, countries are also cautious because they don't want to overcommit to something that they can't achieve. And so it's a really interesting discussion right now about how do countries balance that. And, as we've been talking about this, the way of balancing that is, recognize it, move forward on the adaptation side. You can improve the quantification as you're heading towards sort of 2024 and updates in that regard. So continue to make progress. Maybe don't commit to particular greenhouse gas targets unless you feel confident in the numbers within your country. But you can improve the qualification going on. The important thing is to continue to make progress.
We'll hear more from Steve Crooks in a few minutes as we conduct a virtual flyover of the Indus Red Plus Mangrove project in Pakistan. Now, I don't have a travel budget, so I couldn't get to Pakistan myself. I did make it to year-end climate talks in Madrid, where Steve had a nifty video of the project on continuous loop. It was a promo video without a lot of context, but we sat down and kind of talked through what we were seeing, and you'll hear that in a minute. If you're wondering why it took me so long to get this up, well, quite frankly, I couldn't afford to do it sooner. The one complaint I get most often is that I don't do enough episodes. And the reason is that they take time, and time is money. I put a lot of work into sounding like I know what I'm talking about, and I want to generate more episodes, but I also don't want to just phone them in. If you like my work and you want more of it, and if you want me to improve it by maybe getting a good sound guy or something, then help me out by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's Patreon/Bionic Planet. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. If money's tight, you can also help just by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Remember, the more stars I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet the climate challenge. We can do it if we all work together. I recorded this next segment in Madrid as we sat in a hallway watching a video on Steve's iPad. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I actually think it does. It sounded pretty good to me, better than I thought. You can be the real judge. You open up by saying that there was this issue with construction, right?
Yeah.
And the construction issues upstream are what caused the mangroves to disappear.
Yeah, so the Indus Delta is it's the 5th largest delta in the world. So, it's really big. And the mangrove is the 7th largest mangrove in the world.
Mangrove forest.
Mangrove forest, yeah, not a single tree, but mangrove forest. But over the last, 50 to 100 years, there's been a lot of upstream construction of dams and rerouting of water and to go to agriculture. So the Indus River system has been completely, replumbed. And that's a couple of effects on the delta. The water doesn't get to the delta during the dry season anymore. It only flows during the wet season and big events. And the sediment supply, which is like an enormous sediment supply of something like 400 million tons a year, has been cut down to next to nothing. So there's been this drastic effect all the way through the system, but all the way down to the delta.
But my understanding on mangroves is that it's this hydrology that impacts the trees. You're planting trees where the hydrology has changed. Shouldn't you be first dealing with the hydrology, or has that been done already?
Maybe there'll be some intervention to improve the hydrology of the whole system. What's happening right now is because of the lack of sediment, there's some erosion at the bottom taking place. They're losing mangroves there. And where the fresh water is not flowing anymore, like particularly around the margins, which is salinizing, they're losing mangroves there. So they're kind of condensing down towards the center. What's happened with the agriculture in the middle is that, people moved in and they put rice fields in, and the people, they live off the rice that they grow and the fish that they catch. And with the loss of the water, those rice fields are salinizing, and so it's creating a space where mangroves can go back into where those rice fields are. And what the Sindh Forestry Department are doing is they're trying to reconnect and provide more fresh water to the remaining rice fields and then restore mangroves on the abandoned rice fields and help the people that way.
And when I look at the planting, it looks very geometrical here. Is there a reason for that? It looks like a Hare plantation. You've got them. Is that? I mean, I always thought that when you're restoring a forest, the trees should be clustered or something. Or is that more of a mixed forest?
Well, this is one of the kind of things I guess you see particularly in South Asia. It's forestry people who are coming in and doing these mangroves projects, and the commissioner of the forestry department there in Sindh, he's been doing this actually for 30 years. Mm-hmm. They come from a traditional forestry and they just plant in rows. And when we were there, he said, these beautiful rows of mangroves. And one way it is helpful in that, when they're explaining to people that they did actually come in and plant, you can see it is a plantation. You know, it's not that they're just showing people a mangrove and pretending this way it was. So it does have a validation benefit to it. But I think ecologically, you're right. You know, there'd be better to cluster trees and the like.
Okay, and let's continue on here. So you guys are coming down a river. Now, what have we got here? Looks like you've got these bridges. When the mangroves come in, this would be like a nice little boardwalk.
So there's a couple of things that we're seeing there. One was a fishing vessel. That's from the village of Kitibunda, and that's right in the middle of the mangroves. And so that's one of the places where the people are living. And the people either fish in the channel or they go out into deeper water, and so they're fishing right there. I'll mention also that what's really interesting here is that the Sindh Forestry Department offer people the opportunity to have shrimp ponds or aquaculture ponds instead of fishing, and they prefer to go fishing.
Because it's their culture.
It's their culture. And so it's actually helpful because it's not destroying the delta with these shrimp ponds. The boardwalk that we saw there is it's actually put in where the Forestry Department have their nursery for growing seedlings, and so it's just an access point in and out. But it's a nice access point for seeing the sites. But the delta out there is completely rural. There's no boardwalks in most of the places or any kind of access like that.
Okay, because I was at James Cairo's mangrove restoration project in Ghazi Bay, and they had created a beautiful boardwalk that you could walk out through. And I just, to draw on ecotourism, I thought maybe that's what this was. This is purely a functional.
Yeah, that's purely functional. There is scope here for ecotourism. The delta is beautiful. It is really, really. It's like, imagine the Mississippi Delta. It's that kind of scale. It's enormous. You see these crazy things like they have herds of camel walking around the delta and water buffalo. And actually part of the management strategy, because the camel are brought in by the villagers, is to direct where you can actually feed the camels and protect other mangroves from overgrazing.
Okay. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about this area, set the stage a little bit more. We kind of plunged in.
Okay. So this is the Indus Delta, and it's in Pakistan. It flows all the way through from the Himalayas down to almost the Indian border. And it has an enormous flow of water. I forget what the number is right now, but it gets a very large flow, massive sediment supply. And it feeds all the way through Pakistan till it gets down to the coast. Mangroves capture, just like any tree, CO2 from the atmosphere. It goes into the biomass. Some of that biomass, either through the roots or falling leaves, ends up in the sediment. And as these mangroves build up with sea level rise, it gets trapped in the sediment.
And the mangroves will migrate too, right?
Yeah, they occupy a certain niche, an elevation just above mean sea level through to the elevation of the highest tides. And so if sea level changes relative to the ground elevation, then they'll migrate with that. So if you're like the Indus Delta here, which is pretty barren at the back, as sea level rises, they'll migrate inwards landwards back into what is now upland areas.
Are there people there? What are they going to bump into? I mean, is it?
Well, this area is pretty sparsely populated.
Yeah.
People have been moving out because of the salinization. So you get villages, you get small towns, you get agriculture, you get a lot of abandoned agriculture, and you get a sort of upland shrub type of areas. And so it's actually a system that has very little infrastructure in it.
And what benefits come to people of having these mangroves migrating inward like this, or migrating across their land?
These mangroves are providing a lot of valuable fish habitat. The local villagers, they're dependent upon fish. They fish for subsistence living, and they also sell it. So living right within the mangroves is right with their food supply. And they recognize actually the value of the mangroves in terms of food. They also get some levels of protection of the mangroves from waves. And one of the villages that we visited, they saw, for instance, their rice fields where the mangroves are being planted were protected from wave activity, whereas before they had to continuously repair the mud berms that were keeping the water out from the rice fields.
And now, are these people giving up the rice fields as well? I mean, eventually the rice fields will become mangroves, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's going to be a process of a continuing adaptation. Sea level's rising. The soils are salinizing because they're losing the water. People are migrating out of the system. They're moving to Karachi and other places. The Sindh Forest Department is trying to reroute some water into this more condensed rice field area to maintain the rice fields. And as part of the deal, as well as getting paid to plant and look after the mangroves, they're getting mangroves back, which supports the fisheries. So and they're going to get other benefits as well. The project here is going to bring in some medical facilities, school facilities, and that kind of thing. So the project's trying to improve the quality of life for them, but with climate change, they're going to be faced with these pressures of sea level rise ongoing.
Mm-hmm. And how high above sea level are they?
Oh, they're right at it. You know.
So they're really this is going to be gone in a few years, right?
Yeah,
I mean, how quickly can the mangroves migrate? Can they migrate fast enough to keep up with the sea level rise?
Yeah, in an area which is flat like this, yes, they can. You know,
right.
You know, because there's a lot of space and it's gradual. Like the slope here is maybe 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 1,000. So a meter of sea level rise, you know, you've got kilometers of space that you can migrate in with here.
Okay. And how high is the elevation over those kilometers?
Oh, it's really flat. You know, so let's say a 1 in 10,000, so 1 meter up would be 10 kilometers inland. And so, and that delta goes out for like 50 kilometers.
Wow, okay. Yeah. Now, and this is all being paid for through carbon finance. Is that what's paying for this?
Well, originally they had financing from the World Bank, and maybe even before that, it was just internal money within the Forestry Department. And so they've been doing it on a shoestring. And the actual project costs are relatively low. It's, you know, less than a few dollars per hectare to replant these mangroves. What's really interesting about it is that the mangrove planting, in many parts of the world, you actually grow the trees to the age of 2, and then you plant them at that age. But here the commissioner is very thoughtful about where he puts the mangroves. He waits till the elevations are right, which is, you know, one of the critical things. And they're just going out, and every 3 meters they're just planting a seedling in the ground, and it's been pretty successful.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm still not clear on why. Like, what if they did? Why did they disappear? Were they chopped up, or was it because of the hydrology? Was it the construction?
So there's a few things. Direct displacement for rice fields, and
so meaning they were chopped out.
They were chopped down. The land was converted to agriculture, and then there's quite a lot of damage with cattle. So cattle was coming in and eating it. There was cutting for wood supply, for burning and for building houses, and then there's been this pervasive change in the water supply and the hydrology, which has had an impact also.
And why will the hydrology no longer have an impact, or was that so marginal that it didn't matter?
Well, the hydrology is going to have an impact, and so the margins will salinize, and gradually this delta is contracting towards the center. Effectively, what remains of the river, it's contracting in that way. But what the project's allowing it to do is for it to adapt much more quickly to that. There's a lot of space here, and it's allowing the trees to be reestablished and get them back in the ground and slow the rate. We need to look at the numbers. I've seen a couple of different studies. Some are saying that net overall, there's still a loss of mangroves in the Indus, but then I've seen another study which said that the net changes is tending towards 0 now. So we still need to work out exactly what that baseline is, but we're going to look at it.
And that's because of this project, or just because this project doesn't cover the whole Indus, right?
No, it covers the central part. So Sindh is on the east part, and then it's around where the river flows and where the Indus River flows. Over by Karachi, it's not covering that part of the area there.
Now, so they were on a shoestring, the government was.
Yeah.
And now you've come in with carbon finance, or how? Like, what are you bringing? Is this a carbon project, or?
Yeah, well, there's a company called Indus Delta Capital, which are based out of London, but it's actually Pakistanis who started this company, and they're working with the Sindh Forestry Department and Commission to enact a carbon project, and they've been trying to build this for nearly 8 years now, and they're getting really close to fruition. And the intent is that to accelerate the amount of planting which is taking place. You know, the Sindh Forestry Commission actually have the world record now, I think, for number of seedlings planted in a day, and they planted over 1 million seedlings in one day alone.
1 million in one day.
1 million in one day.
And they did that, and it wasn't just a one-day thing. It was part of an ongoing process.
It's part of an ongoing process. They started slowly 28, 30 years ago, and they've been, over the last 5 years, planting, thousands of hectares per year, but they've kind of reached the limit of what they can do with the amount of money that they've got. And the hope is that we can bring in additional financing, which will improve the quality of life of the villagers, as mentioned, with medical facilities, etc. But they can actually go out and they can plant a lot more mangroves each year.
And that I guess because that's always the thing with carbon finance, is to get the carbon to get a carbon payment, you have to show that you needed the money to execute the project, right? So, what will the carbon payments make possible here?
Well, under the VCS, you can get credit for a carbon project, anything up to 5 years before you submit your PD intent, and so they'll be able to get credit for the mangroves that they have planted over the last 5 years, and that's going to help them actually finance stepping up to the next part.
Right. Okay. Let's go back to the video here.
So you can see the scale of it.
So who's this?
This is Rais Ahmed Wagan, and he is the Chief Conservator of the Forestry Department of Sindh. And he is the guy that really has been out there for 30 years planting mangroves and working with the villagers. And they started doing this, to try and do something about the loss of mangroves that was taking place, but also to work with the villagers to try and sort of maintain their quality of life.
Okay. And he's probably not here in Madrid right now, right?
No, we were hoping to try and get them all here for this meeting, but it didn't work out. But next year, we want to get them all here.
Next year is this year, 2020, and it's not happening because of the pandemic. And I feel their pain in not having the budget to travel, or in my case, not having the budget to hire a sound engineer or maybe a second set of ears to give these shows a good critical listen before I polish them off and upload them, or even take a little time off of work so I can put more of my own time into these shows. If you listen to NPR or BBC or Deutsche Welle, where I come from, listen to their podcasts. It takes them several minutes sometimes to list all of the people who make each show possible. But I have just me, and only in my spare time. I don't even have all of me. If you want more Bionic Planet, then help me deliver it by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. If money's tight, you can also help just by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Remember, the more stars I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we must reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet the climate challenge. We can do it if we all work together.
Rise is one of those people that's just been out there doing this for years, really under the radar. Somebody has just been out there trying to replant the mangroves, learning as he's been going along, so he actually knows how to do a pretty good job, but he's just one of those people that's been out there planting millions of trees.
Yeah, there's so many of these guys out there, and they've been fighting the good fight, and without any resources, and now we can finally get them something to work with.
Absolutely.
And these are the rice paddies you were talking about?
These are actually shrimp ponds.
Okay.
So there were a number of shrimp ponds built, but it was a very small area. Mm-hmm. But just behind these, there are rice fields. We'll probably see some later on in the video, maybe.
Okay, and what happens? These shrimp ponds are going to be gone pretty soon, right?
Yeah, these shrimp ponds will be gone.
They'll be mangroves.
They'll be mangroves. The villagers really didn't take to them. And so here you can see the square or the rectangular areas there.
Yeah, I see that. It almost looks like a view of Chicago from the Sears Tower.
It is like that.
At the edge of a park, and it looks like you've got these rows and rows of mangroves going on and on out to the horizon, and up front you've got this rectangle with a few little clusters of trees, and it looks like either a river or a canal or a road going through it. I can't tell what that is.
Yeah, a canal just along the edge and the river's just behind us. Okay. And so those rectangles are the abandoned rice fields that you see right there.
Okay.
And they actually extend in the distance, but they've been overprinted by the mangrove plantation.
And the mangrove will move into this area then?
Yeah.
Okay. So it looks like we were just passing through, it looks like a dried out canal. Is that what that is?
No, this is actually a natural tidal channel. And
okay.
So there are still some of these around the rice fields, but in the more natural part of the delta also. As mudflats build up and become mangroves or marshes, if you're in further north, channels form at the same time, and the channels are incredibly important for conveying water in and out of the site, and they're incredibly important for fish, because the small fish like to hide from big fish, and so as the tide comes in, they need somewhere to go, so they go up the channel, and then they'll spread into the mangroves when the water covers the sediments, the soil surface.
What happens when the water goes out? Do the fish die?
Just all goes back in the same direction.
They just trickle back in.
Yes, the small fish like to hide in the shallow water away from the big fish.
By small, you mean baby fish, or you mean small size, like adults that are just small
Both.
species?
Yeah, it could be both.
Now, who's this here?
So this is Alamgir Gandapur. He's actually a forestry commissioner also, just like Riaz. But Alamgir came down from the mountains for this project. And he was planting trees up in the mountain areas. The company is with, which is now called Indus Delta Capital, they were really trying to start a RED project in the mountain areas. But they found it too politically difficult. And so they started to look around which other provinces were easier to work with that had a RED need. And so they eventually found themselves in the Indus Delta and working with the Sindh province.
Is it RED or reforestation, afforestation? Or afforestation, reforestation?
It's a bit of both. So there's conservation, management of cattle, management of wood cutting, and an awful lot of reforestation work.
Now, why is there this thick blob of trees in the middle of these nice rows? Or is that rows? Is that replanted? Or is that?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point there. So that blob of trees was actually the first plantation that Riaz put out there, 28, 30 years ago.
Wow.
And so, it's still there. He just started out with a small plantation. And it's there. So you can see how they kind of develop. The trees don't get really big in the Indus Delta. It is a saline environment. Mm-hmm. You're working with Rhizophora and you're working with Avicennia. But, we have a time series that goes back 30 years now, so we can get a growth curve for the trees. So we get a pretty good projection of how they're going to do.
Gotcha. And again, the thing is that the trees might be small, but the carbon's not in the trees, it's in the ground.
Yes, exactly right. I'll tell you a story, Steve.
Yeah.
So there was a paper came out a couple of years ago, and I think it was Nature Geoscience, and it pointed out that the big deltas of the world, particularly around South Asia and East Asia, are really the conduit of carbon from the atmosphere down into the lithosphere, because
the lithosphere is the ocean, the sea?
So the lithosphere being, the geology underneath us. And so these deltas are kilometers thick. And so when
kilometers thick.
And so when they take carbon out of the atmosphere, it gets buried. This is the source of oil in gas. And they, over 20 million years, have been extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere and permanently burying it. Now, the consequence of that...
Well, permanently until we come along and...
Well, yes, permanently. Yeah, till oil companies come along and put it all back in the atmosphere. But, when you do the calculations and you look how much CO2 that is, that's enough to take a hothouse world that existed 20 million years ago and then move us into the icehouse world that we've had for the last 2 million years, just gradually extracting CO2 and burying it in these deltas. But of course, as we've converted all these deltas to something else, that process has been just truncated, it's gone. So we've disrupted a 20 million year old process of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Okay, how about the places that we were at in Vietnam all those years ago? Was that below sea level? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, indeed. That's right, Steve. Yes, the Red River Delta, that's where we were. And we drove through 100 miles of what used to be mangroves, but it was now rice fields and the like. Mm-hmm. And all of that is going to be, it's already at risk of when cyclones come through, it's all at sea level or below. And at some point in the future, it's all going to be, mangroves again or subtidal.
Right, and so I guess then it comes to an issue where if that's going to happen, then we in the industrialized world, we have two reasons to pay these people. One is it's our emissions that are causing this mess. So we have to pay them to help them adapt, but then we also have to help them to create mangroves, or will mangroves just naturally come back when they leave?
Well, if you can do it in a thoughtful, purposeful way, you're going to be much more likely to have a successful outcome, because you can put the mangroves back in the place where they will survive. But when things happen catastrophically, then you just get some sort of random outcome, which is more difficult to try and then engineer back to what you would really like to have. And so ideally you want some sort of managed adaptation process where people are not fleeing from something, where the system is not responding to a catastrophic event, but actually some sort of managed, planned approach. Of course, how good are we at that? Where in the world do you really see this happening?
Well, the Netherlands. What do you mean by a managed approach?
Let's take another country as an example. Let's think about Guyana and Suriname, where we've been working recently. So most of the population lives on about 8% of the country's area, and that's the coastal plain. Town of Georgetown is built up right against the edge, and so levees are built right at the edge of where mangroves used to be. Everybody's living below the elevation of highest tides. And then they have this enormous country with very low population. And so if you were thinking about it, you'd really now want to be moving upslope and move Georgetown to New Georgetown, maybe 5 meters above the tide. And so you could be out of the way, and then you do an adaptation strategy. Maybe have your agriculture down on the coastal plain, but be able to pull out when storms come along so people are not at risk of flooding, or start to restore your ecosystems and bit by bit. But even for those countries which, you're not moving a large population, but it's a lot of money for them, they're still not at the place where they have a decision about, do they try and build more infrastructure like the Netherlands, which is incredibly expensive, it's going to become more and more expensive as time goes by, or do they develop a strategy where they try and move back out of these areas? We look at other places. Belize, they moved their capital city out of the floodplain some years ago. Jakarta, they're looking at this now. They're moving Jakarta.
They're moving Jakarta.
Yeah.
How did I not hear about that?
It's out there somewhere. It was announced last year. They're moving it to Borneo.
Wow. So they're going to just abandon... Jakarta is such a densely populated, thick city, but it does flood all the time. I've been there a few times, and I always had to walk around with my pants rolled up. Yeah. So I can see why they would be doing that, but it's just... That's a massive undertaking. How do you move all those people? And then what happens, is it the whole city, even the part where the capital is further inland, or is it the whole city? What are they?
I don't know the details, but, the way these things start is the federal agencies move. And so they go and they start...
Like when they move Bonn to Berlin, basically the German capital.
Yeah, you move... It would be the same sort of thing in Georgetown. If you move the federal agencies, everything that's related to the federal agencies will move with them. But then, what happens to everything else, all that infrastructure? Are they just going to abandon it so we'll have mangroves in amongst streets?
Yeah, that's... Yeah. And nobody knows. That's a question.
That's a question, I think.
How much of the sea level rise is baked in already, and how much is avoidable?
Oh, that's a really good question. When you look at the rate of sea level rise that we have, and you compare that, Ramsdorff's work was along this lines, and you compare it
Stefan
Ramsdorff, at Potsdam. When you look at the geological record, the amount of sea level rise that happens per amount of CO2, with glacial cycles, we should have a lot more sea level rise than we do now. And so it looks like there's a lot of hysteresis in the system. There's a lot of...
Hysteresis?
There's a lot of delay in the system, So energy's building up. There's going to be a shift. Sea level rise is going to happen. And then we might try and reduce our CO2 levels, and it just continues because, there's inertia in the system effectively rather than hysteresis.
It's kind of like with the seasons. I guess in theoretically, like the late summer when it's hottest, we've already passed the hottest part in terms of the sun, but the heat, it took a while for the system to catch up.
Yeah, exactly. The heat's captured in the land and the water around you. And that is likely to happen with sea level rise also. There'll be that inertia in the system that we're already living with. There's a slow start, and it'll be slow to end as well. And then, of course, if we have issues with the collapse of ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, then that will continue on for quite some time. It's very hard to reestablish an ice sheet again once it gets going.
Yeah, because ice is so thick, and it's all this thick coldness, and now it's already melted deep down inside of it too, right? It's gonna...
Exactly. Yeah, once you get, water flowing underneath an ice sheet, it's a lubricant that just allows the ice to flow frictionlessly.
It just slides right off.
Just slides right off.
So I guess that we're looking at the situation where we've got a certain amount of sea level rises baked into the system, and we don't really know how much is there. So we could do all this mangrove restoration, and then a big sheet of ice, could it all be for naught, or is that too pessimistic?
Well, Well, the IPCC document said, with sea level rise, we're going to lose between 20 and 90% of coastal wetlands. And that's a very big range. And so it basically means we're either going to, at one end, lose nothing, at the other end, lose everything. And of course, it's somewhere in between. But if you build in adaptation, it gives you the opportunity to maintain as much as possible. Now, if you have a nice gentle slope at the back and you don't put infrastructure in the way, that gives you a lot of adaptive capacity like they have in the Indus Delta. But if you have cities around the back, so one of the best things we could do is not expand cities and infrastructure in low-lying areas. One of the scarcest resources that we have in coastal systems is space. So create space where ecosystems can move as the climate is changing. And so create space elsewhere where cities can move and put them out of harm's way so we can put the ecosystems where they want to be along the coast.
Turning to the U.S., maybe a city like Miami, do we write that off? Is Miami over with?
Oh, Miami's toast.
Yeah.
Because it's very low, but the rocks underneath it are just porous. It's a sponge. And so you can't even build a wall around Miami because the water just comes up from below. So yes, Miami is one of the most vulnerable places in the world.
Wow. Chicago's okay though, right? We're 182 meters above sea level.
You're doing okay in Chicago. Everybody from Miami is going to move back to Chicago.
I don't know. Some of them can come. Okay, so let's see. So going back to the mangroves, I think we've covered. Is there something we should close with? I'm trying to think. We kind of swooped around a bit.
Well, I think there's a number of things we can sort of recognize here. One, these villagers living in the Indus Delta are in a very poor state. They don't have healthcare. And one of the villages we went to, we were told they have 90% hepatitis in that village. And so using some of this money to bring health services can be really beneficial to people which are just so far away from any other kind of infrastructure like that. And then the other thing to recognize, like in the UK, they have an announcement that they want to plant 1 billion trees across the UK. This project alone is going to plant 1 billion trees in the Indus Delta. And so it's a phenomenal number.
Just the project.
Just this one project is going to plant. This is over 50 years, but it's 1 billion trees. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's pretty exciting. In the blue carbon world, we've looked at a lot of very small projects, but it's nice, really exciting, in fact, to find that there's big projects like this there that are out there.
Mm-hmm. That's oceanographer, sedimentologist, and coastal ecosystem guru, Steve Crooks. You will not like me saying that. Closing out this edition of Bionic Planet. If you want more Bionic Planet, then help me deliver it by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet, all one word. Bionic Planet is one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. The address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. If money's tight, you can also help by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access me through. Remember, the more stars I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet the climate challenge. We can do it if we all work together. And that wraps up today's show. From Chicago, I'm Steve Zwick. Thanks for listening.